On Mondays with Mo, we're going to be taking a look at 2008's Dark Sector, developed by Digital Extremes and published by D3 Publisher, originally releasing on the Xbox 360, PlayStation 3, and Windows PC. And there are two very good reasons I've chosen this Monday, rather than any other Monday in existence, to talk about Dark Sector. First and foremost, I've been playing a lot of Warframe once again, and I'm ready to keep rocking and rolling with content for that game here on the channel. Believe it or not, there's a connection there for those of you who haven't already made it, or those of you who don't know about it. We'll get to more of that in a second. The second part of it is a lot more to do with that connection, because Danny O'Dwyer and his NoClip project have just launched the first part of their Warframe documentary, which is going to take a look at everything Digital Extremes, including Dark Sector, how Warframe was essentially forced into making 2008's Dark Sector by D3 Publisher, and how Digital Extremes would save themselves by building Warframe in just 12 freaking months. It's gonna be awesome, and I haven't actually watched it yet because I wanted to sit down, talk about Dark Sector today, give you guys some of my theories as to how Dark Sector 2008 came about, especially considering how much of a far cry it is from the OG Dark Sector concept, which has a hell of a lot more in common with Warframe. And then I'm going to go watch that, and I strongly recommend you guys do the same. Feel free to share some of your old school sort of uninformed theories and how everything went down. We'll talk a lot about sort of the connections that exist within Dark Sector to Warframe. We can just have a good old time and then go check out Danny O'Dwyer's documentary. If you love video games, you need to be watching Danny's work at NoClip, because it is phenomenal, first and foremost, in terms of its production quality, its editing, its storytelling. And, well, because he's just doing something that no one else in the industry is really doing, at least not at that level of detail. He's going behind the scenes, telling us the stories about the games that we love and know and have played for potentially a very long time. It's not something that often happens in the industry. Typically, all of the hard work and all of the craziness that happens behind game development just kind of goes in the shadows, and people don't really get to see how high risk it is to make video games. So, let's get moving forward here and talk a little bit about 2008's Dark Sector. Now, you, of course, take on the role of protagonist Hayden Tenno, who is just kind of like, you know, he's that typical soldier-esque guy at the start of the game, like, you know, I'm special forces, but kind of morally confused here. Should I be killing these people? I don't know if I can do this anymore, man. They don't really tell us too much about it. The whole story is kind of rushed, and things get crazy really fast. But the most important part of Dark Sector is not its intro, which is actually done in a really cool sort of black and white style experience. It's once Hayden gets infected. That's when the game quickly turns around and becomes quite different and a hell of a lot more special than it ever would have been had it just been a through and through generic military style third-person shooter, which I think was probably a lot more about what D3 had in mind for Digital Extremes. So if we look back at the OG Dark Sector concept, it's very sci-fi. In fact, it looks a lot more like Splinter Cell in space than anything Dark Sector ended up delivering, which is a lot more like sci-fi Gears of War, because Gears of War is already sci-fi, so that's a really good reference, Tony. Anyway, you get what I'm saying here. My thought behind this, my process was always this. D3 is a Japanese publisher. In fact, they have relations with Bandai Namco. Whenever we typically see Japanese publishers, like corporation side of it, working with Western developers, they just look at Western trends, and they typically want their studio to follow those trends, because like most corporations, not just Japanese ones, not just ones working with you know, developers overseas, they are simply looking at trends. Oh, well, that's successful. Battle Royale's successful. Why don't you guys take that really cool original concept you had and make it a Battle Royale? I don't have a problem with a studio, a publisher, or a developer wanting to get into a specific genre because it's doing well, but I do have a problem when one idea that was probably originally unique on its own right is twisted and reshaped to fit what's popular. And that's probably exactly what happened with D3 and Digital Extremes. They had this really out there sci-fi experience. It's 2008 though, cover-based shooters are a thing. Gears of War has been successful. You guys should definitely do a third-person cover-based shooter. Oh, and by the way, you totally can't set it in space because everybody's kind of doing the destroyed beauty on Earth type thing, so we're thinking like the USSR. You know, just come up with some sort of a city or something like that. Make your game there. The end result, however, for 2008's Dark Sector is a very interesting juxtaposition, because DE, and I think this really proves their talent and their ability to work under what was probably not the most enjoyable of conditions, still manages to inject an absurd amount of sci-fi in terms of the game's storytelling, its atmosphere, and of course the design of what are essentially the Warframes, including Hayden Tenno as he basically turns into Excalibur. We see Nyx in there. We see a lot of other monsters and creatures under that same sort of design aesthetic that makes up the Warframes in Warframe. It's really cool how they managed to do that. And again, the end result is you sort of bumbling around this really boring and dull Eastern European city, but there's just crazy sci-fi stuff stomping throughout that city, and you are a part of that with your glaive and your ability to cut people's limbs off at will and make them scream bloody murder as they bleed all over the streets of the USSR. It's actually a really dark and violent game as well, like far more than Warframe, you know, like ever is. I mean, Warframe, yeah, has like gore and decapitation and people can get cut in half and stuff like that, but Dark Sector really sort of ran that home, especially because you're killing a lot less people in a much longer period of time than you do in Warframe. So when you chop a guy's head off or chop a guy's arm off and he just holds on to his stub and screams, his blood just, you know, just pours everywhere, it's like, damn, okay, the glaive is pretty powerful. This is pretty gnarly. You know, they really went all in with that. And I actually kind of liked that part of Dark Sector, but again, it always felt to me like it existed because, oh, well, Gears of War is really violent, and, you know, violent games make violent video games, you know? So I don't know how much of that was ever DE and how much of that was like the game needs more gore, needs more violence. But nonetheless, I actually just kind of liked it at the time, and I still like it today. It just kind of always, I think, pushed home the severity of cutting someone's limb off with a crazy glaive made of organic matter that's somehow fused to your body. Again, the story, man, just really nonsensical, confusing sci-fi goodness, and it only gets stranger. As time goes on, you end up fighting a giant Cthulhu-style monster. You know, Nyx shows up again, and you go Nyx versus Excalibur, essentially. It's just actually a really cool game. I mean, I guess that's the thing about Dark Sector. You know, it was born out of circumstance, no doubt. Circumstances and an environment that probably wasn't the best to work in for DE. But yet they made something actually kind of special. You know, as much as it's been shoehorned into the third-person shooter system, they went out of their way to like add in a modding system so you could, you know, mess with your weapons. The glaive and Hayden Tenno and his infection, quote-unquote, level up. There's a lot of puzzle solving with the glaive that I think is actually really well done. And the glaive and its ability to sort of retrieve weapons. The weapons, by the way, which are locked out because of an infection system, you know, burn out over a short period of time. There's actually just a really solid gameplay loop in Dark Sector, and it only evolves and gets better as time goes on, and you unlock more powers for your infection, and you get the ability to acquire more weapons. It's a really good blending of like what DE probably wanted to do with Dark Sector in terms of like ability and like suit powers, and then all of the systems that you would want in a good third-person shooter, like, you know, progression and weapon upgrades. The more I think about it, the more I'm like, man, they did something really good. They took two completely different ideas, they had to mold them together, probably in a short period of time, and they just made it work, you know? I won't say that any of it's like over the top amazing and like this is an incredible execution, but it's two ideas that have been done worse individually by other people, done actually relatively well. And again, there are a hell of a lot of connections here to Warframe, the Lotus symbol, which is even in the Dark Sector cover art. I believe most of the community just kind of makes up their own theories with this thing. Quote me if I'm wrong for any of you Warframe players. Most people do understand or believe that they are two separate universes, but a lot of people say, oh, there could be connections to it. I've always liked to hold by the idea that it could all be connected in one way or another. The idea that Hayden Tenno maybe, you know, has some sort of a connection to the original concept of the Tenno, although that story doesn't hold up very well the more you play Warframe. But nonetheless, I think it's an interesting mishmash of things, and I've always liked sort of just stringing together nonsensical theories. And I'm actually really excited to sit down and watch Daniel Dwyer's documentary to see if anything's actually connected or if DE just comes out and says, listen, no. This was all just based on circumstance. It's all over the place. We've given up on any sort of connection to any of it. Just enjoy the fact that this all exists in a very, you know, close time period, and that we were able to make Warframe happen and save our studio, because Warframe, of course, is self-published. DE went out on their own and was like, let's do this. So there you have, ladies and gentlemen, 2008's Dark Sector. Do I recommend you play it? Yes. However, if you can play it on the Xbox 360 or the PlayStation 3, that is most definitely the best place to do it. It was not a very good PC port. It doesn't play that well with mouse and keyboard. The sensitivity settings are really rough around the edges. It also has a lot of like artifacting and weird visual issues I simply could not get rid of on the PC. But if you plug in a controller on PC, it's not terrible. There's like aim acceleration. You'll get used to it though, and I think the gameplay, the story, that crazy juxtaposition of this sort of generic military shooter environment with some actually good ideas infused into it, and this extreme sci-fi environment is just a lot of fun. And if you're a Warframe fan, I think it's a must play. The campaign runs like 6 to 7 hours. It's just a good little weekend romp, if you will, and you'll find a lot of fun little connection points in there to Warframe that I think will make you smile. So feel free to share all of your thoughts down in the comment section below. I gotta roll out and go watch that Danny O'Dwyer NoClip documentary. I'll have it linked down in the description below. I recommend you do the same. Give Danny some support. Slap him a subscription over on YouTube, and even check out his work on Patreon because he just makes really good stuff. And any support from anyone is more than deserved. I will see you in the next one.